live and in color, TBS presents the new game in town, the World Football League. Tonight's game is brought to you by Chevrolet, whose 1975 roster features two new additions, Nova LN and the sporty Monza 2+2, at your Chevy dealers now. And by Fireman's Fund Insurance. And Fireman's Fund Insurance is brought to you by an independent agent near you. Look for his name in the yellow pages for auto, home, life, or business insurance.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well now, how are you, everybody? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon, and it's Good Seats Still Available. Yeah, the curious little podcast that is devoted to, each week, what used to be in professional sports. We love every reason that we can ever find to play the wonderful theme music from the TBS television network, especially from the very hard to find footage of whatever existed in the World Football League, especially the very first season, 1974. Very hard to find clips, but that we've heard it and played it on a couple of other episodes. Our Howard Zuckerberg episode, talking about the TBS network, our Mark Speck episodes about the WFL, etc. But we love to pull it out of the archive and play it for you again, and we got a great excuse for you. We're going to talk about the World Football League, a reminiscence, yes, but sort of a revisit, I guess, or a new look through the lens of ESPN.com reporter and writer and essayist Ryan Hockensmith. We talk about the World Football League, and it's about time we got back to it. If you haven't read Ryan's piece from April 15th of this year, just head over to ESPN.com and find it. We'll have a link for it for you from our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Ryan, episode number 260, and you will find a convenient link right to it. And it's an excellent and well-updated story with some quotes from the legendary Gary Davidson himself. Howard Baldwin, our guest last week, is referenced and quoted in the story, and all kinds of great pictures and reminiscences and some updated little tweaks on what we think is an ongoing and ever unfolding story of the World Football League. And yes, we are desperate to hopefully get Gary Davidson, God willing, and his interest willing as well on this here podcast. And keep your fingers crossed, efforts are being made as I stare at his semi-autobiography, I guess, called Breaking the Game Wide Open, the out-of-print book that was published in 1974, the height of the beginnings, I guess, of his powers and the launch of the World Football League and all of his confidence and bravado for such. But we get into that and a whole bunch of other wild and crazy things with Ryan this week. We kind of go all over the place about our personal and or mutual understandings from our respective research and efforts about what this World Football League thing was. There's so much to unearth about it. And, it was so spectacular in its audaciousness or audacity, whatever the word is, plus its folly. It's probably, of all the topics that we explore and have explored on this little podcast, the most combustible combination of both of those things, aspiration and desperation, shaken vigorously to create. I don't know what it was. It wasn't even a year and a half old when all was said and done. And it was actually really two leagues, if you really get down to it. A 1974 initial league that Davidson and friends got up and running. And then 1975, which was a completely different construct, setup, financial composition, leader in Chris Hemmeter, and that didn't even last a full 1975 season. We get into all that, and it's always a great excuse to do so, and we continue to look for not only Gary Davidson, but any other original sort of members who were there sort of around it. We did scratch the surface a little bit with Howard Baldwin. He was actually there sort of at the beginning with an ill-fated Boston franchise that never fully came to fruition. Actually, it kind of did. It wound up becoming the New York Stars. And then our previous guest, Upton Bell, came to the rescue of that and brought the Stars to Charlotte, where they became, I guess, the Charlotte Stars or the Hornets, really, very quickly. It's debatable as to what day the nickname was for the team. But listen to that episode with Upton Bell to hear sort of that sort of story. And by the way, also listen to our episode 100 with John Sterling, the current voice, one of the current voices of the New York Yankees, who was at the time the voice for the short-lived New York Stars. That's a hoot and then some of an episode. We got a couple of clips of his calls of those games in there too. So we love the World Football League in all its glory and demise. And a great excuse this week, our conversation with ESPN, he says, columnist Ryan Hockensmith, as we remember and reminisce and wonder still about the World Football League. Coming up in just a moment's time. Our sponsor this week, all right, how about it? 417 Helmets. 417helmets.com. 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. Our pal Judd Lasher, that is, in Springfield, near Springfield, Missouri, southwestern part of Missouri. Longtime sponsor and great friend and patron of the show. And of course, like the name implies, mini helmets is what you will find at 417helmets.com. This is the real Magilla. This is real high quality stuff. Schutt, Brand, Riddell, some of the other sort of makers of the bigger helmets themselves. But the real materials used in those official use helmets in mini helmet form. I don't know how Judd does it, but they are one-of-a-kind items. They make great gifts for that football fan in your life. Judd can do all kinds of leagues and does all kinds of teams and leagues from the past, as well as custom helmets. It doesn't even have to be a football team. I mean, it could be your high school team. It could be some other thing. It could be your corporation or company or your civic organization in mini helmet form. Just give them the colors and the logo and stuff, and boom, Judd can make it for you. But, of course, this week, the excuse to go to 417helmets.com, and, of course, a promo code for you, Good Seats, for 10% off all of your purchases, is, of course, all of the great and every single stinking team great of the World Football League. These mini helmets are a sight to behold, and they're even more fun to own for yourself. And it even gets into some of the intricacies. For example, the Philadelphia Bell, as you may remember, were a team in both the 1974 and 1975 versions of the WFL. Judd's got both versions there. They're a little different. And you'll see the intricacies there on the website at 417helmets.com. You can get each version thereof. And again, all of the teams and all the various iterations are there. I'm kind of a big fan of both the Southern California Sun and the Hawaiians. To me, those are the most breathtakingly colorful versions. But you can get them all, collect them all, shall we say. And they're all there for you. All the WFL mini helmets there for you at 417helmets.com. Again, it's collectible helmets and more, and a promo code for you when you visit and purchase early and often. The promo code GOODSEATS to save 10% off all of your purchases. Thanks, Judd, and thanks 417helmets.com for your sponsorship of the show, and especially of this week's episode. Coming up right now, our conversation we had a couple of weeks back with our new pal, Ryan Hockensmith from ESPN.com. Let's talk about his great article about the WFL. And I forgot to give you the actual title of that article. When you go to ESPN.com and search it up, it's called The Renegade Who Took on the NFL and the NBA and the NHL, of course, Gary Davidson. And here's our conversation with Ryan. Please, as always, enjoy. So why don't you give our audience a bit of a background on your credibility factor here? You're a reporter for ESPN. What's your background in all of that? What have your beats been? And just a little bit of foundational stuff before we get into how the story hit your radar and why.
Well, I started at ESPN. I drove right there out of college. So I've been there ever since 2001 through now. And I started out as an intern, and I had an interest in being a writer. And so I did that for a couple of years and didn't quite work out. So they asked me to try as an editor. I was in my, late 20s, started having kids. If you Google me, you'll see there's some drug and alcohol problems that popped up for me that kind of derailed me in many, many different ways, professionally being one of them. And so I tried my hand as an editor, and from I'd say 2005 or so through just March 1st of this year, I was a full-time editor at ESPN. I worked my way up to deputy editor, oversaw a couple of sports, and had a bunch of people that reported to me, had a bunch of writers that worked for me and other editors, and I managed that as an editor. And I started writing a couple pieces here or there over the last couple of years, and then I thought, boy, my dream my whole life was to be a writer. And I wonder if I could do it. I wonder if in my mid 40s, if I could go for it as a reporter and as a writer again. And so I asked to change positions. And so I got that opportunity starting in March 1st. I became full-time writer. But whenever I started thinking about the WFL, I was still an editor at the time. And so, but when I got this chance, I thought, boy, this is one of my first ones to see if I could sink my teeth into. And so here we are.
Okay. So a couple of things to unpack there. Were you a writer in college and then thought that was your adjunct into the wacky world of ESPN?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, as a kid, I realized that when I was about 15, I was a really good athlete, but not like I'm going to play professionally. And I thought, boy, that's a bummer. I liked the idea of a life in sports. And so I knew as like a teenager, like maybe 15 or 16, I want to be a national sports writer. And so I pursued that in college. I had a really good college career at Penn State, won a bunch of awards and learned a lot. It was a great place to go as a journalist. Let me get my plug in for Penn State for all the journalists out there. It just gave me every opportunity to succeed. Lots of good people. And, if you want to cover sports, a Big Ten school or Stanford or one of these places that has 30 to 30 programs, all winning national titles oftentimes, you couldn't ask for more. And so I got to cover the football team while I was there. And this is what I'm doing right this very moment is exactly what I used to think of as a young boy. Like when I grow up, I want to do that. So here I am.
Well, that's great. And who knows and why or the reasons for how one gets to that point, right? But when one knows that, right, whether that's 15 or 45 or somewhere in between, hell, there are people go through their lives who never really get to that point, right? So, count your blessings and your and the harmony of all that. But then of course, the logical question becomes, why the WFL then as your first sort of like renewed shot at all of this on the writing front?
Well, you want the long version or the short version?
It's a podcast. We've got all day.
Okay. So the long version is that in 2001, when I started at ESPN, I started pitching stories, and one of the places that was the most fertile and didn't have very many people covering it was mixed martial arts. And the access with UFC fighters at the time was incredible. It was beyond anything you could hope for with a college basketball team or an NBA team or NFL coverage. It just was like, the UFC would roll into New York City where I was working at the time, and they'd be like, yeah, just come hang out all night. And then, just hang out with the fighters the next day. And it was like beyond anything you could get your arms around with some of the other sports. And so I started covering the UFC quite a bit early on in my career. And one of the things that happened once the UFC took off was every month there was a new startup that was going to take them on, and they had, they knew how to do it better, and they were going to try to lure talent away, and they had a TV deal in the works. And I watched everybody come for the king, and they all flopped pretty miserably. And some of them did have some success. They got on TV and got some good fighters, but I watched one after the other. I saw how hard it was. Once a league is entrenched, it's not impossible, but it is really hard. When we talk about American sports and you talk about the biggest league from WNBA to NBA to NFL, NBA, these leagues have been around for a long time and have taken lots of shots at them, and they are still the preeminent organizations in each of their sports. And so that's the long version. I've always just had an interest in like what it takes to take on a big entrenched league. And then how it's very, very difficult. And so I've always had that interest in watching everybody try to take on the UFC, and then how the UFC responded and succeeded ultimately. The shorter version of the story is just that I saw, we covered the AFL whenever it took on the NFL. What was that, 4 years ago? And that had a pretty explosive end to its story.
You mean the
AAFL?
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Careful. Our listeners will be yelling at their devices saying, wait a minute, AFL, this kid doesn't even know.
Sorry. What was it? The American Alliance? What was the
Alliance of American Football, i.e. the AAF.
AAF. Gotcha. Yeah. So I watched that come along, and then, I've seen two versions of the XFL now, or 1.5, I guess. And so I went down a rabbit hole maybe 3 or 4 years ago, looking at all the leagues that took a swing, all the startups that tried to take a run at the NFL. And I just ended up on the WFL Wikipedia page. And I just was reading one thing after the other and thinking, oh my goodness, this is a movie. It's a dumpster fire. That's a phrase we ended up using, with my story. But boy, there was so many interesting things that happened. And as I assessed it, I thought, boy, I think, this is just my opinion after doing this story and reading a lot about it and listening to a lot of your podcasts, there's a version of the WFL that really had a good chance, and it went down in flames epically. But I was really struck by, I think they were actually very close in retrospect to actually having a chance at a real upstart that took on the NFL. I don't know if you can topple the NFL even back then, but they had a real good chance, in my opinion. And so that's what drew me to it. And then it became actually a really hard story to write, because I was I wanted to write a story about the WFL. I didn't want to try to write the story of the WFL, because it's so rich. That's why how many podcasts do you think you've done just on the WFL?
Oh, plenty. But with all due respect, it kind of still really hasn't been done, Ryan.
Yeah.
I mean, in many respects, the editor in you, whether that's digital or video or whatever, right? And obviously, just down your hallway or on another floor, right? Is the, occasionally verdant 30 for 30, franchise. I don't know if Connor Shell would, I'm sure. Let's put it this way: the irony is rich, right? Because you mentioned the AAF, which people barely remember even 2+ years ago, right? Now we're on the cusp of doing it all over again this year and next year with the current USFL, which is its own ball of wax from the original version, and the third version of the XFL. Taking on the man that is the NFL is still is still, in fashion, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, it's been one after the other, one after the other.
well, but I guess the question in there is that, so what did you think you knew about this WFL? Because you could be, especially of a younger generation than yours truly, you could be forgiven for speeding by that bump, shall we say, in the look back of like the more glorious and richly colorful AFL, right, which was more successful, or even some of the earlier attempts like the AAFC back in the 50s and that kind of stuff, right? The WFL is, I don't know, frankly, I think even a blip on the historical radar. But to your point, what a gigantic pothole of intrigue it was, or is still, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea that I had never heard of it, I was born in 1977, so I'm a middle-aged dude. I had never heard of it, and I thought, boy, that's kind of a shame, because there's some interesting characters, there's some interesting lessons to learn. And so I thought that's part of what drew me to it. Some of these other leagues that have maybe, I mean, the USFL in the mid 80s had quite a bit of, I mean, they had a good run. But I felt like I felt like I did have an understanding of that on some base level. And I just thought football fans deserve to know about the WFL. So I thought its lack of, the lack of general public awareness of this league, I thought it added to it made me more interested in it.
So, all right, what did you think you knew about it then, going into the story, and what revealed itself in the process, both from your research and rabbit hole of research? Because there's video, not much, but it's there, it's intriguing, as well as the people that you decided to and ultimately connected with to talk more, from the first person perspective.
Well, I felt like I could not tell this. There've been a few books written about the WFL, and I read Till the Getting's Good, which I thought was a good book about it. And I just didn't think that I had the interest or ability to like write a 100,000 word story that kind of told you everything that happened with the WFL. So
hold on. Before the fact that you actually found an out of print book like that to do, that's already telling you how far gone you've been in terms of research, because that's a hard book to find or afford. And it's out of print.
It did take a while to find, but Dusty Rhodes I enjoyed talking with Dusty Rhodes. She's a great resource on this piece. And she was just like, you have to read that book. So I it took a little while, but I got it and read it. And I thought it was a really good, it was an interesting book to read because it was written, I'm trying to think when it was written, probably like 1975, it had a copyright. So it was written in the moment. And so there's some things that came into clarity about the league many years later, trying to remember the name is it Mark Speck, the author that you had on? Is that his name, Mark Speck?
Yeah, he's become kind of the de facto
a guru. Yeah. I mean, he's written, I think, 4 books, and he has unpacked so much of it. And just had such a good grasp.
Even he would admit there's so much more to go, right? It's just
I know.
It's not like he's making a gigantic living off of that, but he's,
Right.
without people like him, right? The story would not live on.
Yeah, it would be lost to history. I really admire. There's a guy Richie Franklin keeps kind of the web presence of the league going. And I mean, without those people, this thing would just kind of recede into history. And so I went into this and I thought there was 2 things that particularly I thought I could tell a good story about the WFL and use them as my central characters. Because I really do think with stories like this, I think you do want to have it anchored in one person or one sort of angle to it, rather than here's everything you need to know. So I gravitated toward that. The 2 things were Gary Davidson, very interesting. The fact that, I mean, we're probably going to get into this. I mean, this guy had 3 different attempts at major sporting leagues, all going within a couple of years time frame. It just, the idea of somebody doing that blew me away, and what his backstory, and then, postscript, his life since then, that drew me in. And then I think the Dolphins angle on this is just incredible. And so I wondered if I should try to tell it just through the idea that Dolphins undefeated team, and then just the dynasty they had going. That is a NFL. That's going to remain in NFL lore for a long, long time. And so Csonka, Kick, and Warfield all going to the WFL. I thought, boy, that's another way that I could tell it. But I ultimately settled on Davidson. I liked talking to Gary, and we'll probably get into, there's definitely some critics of him, and it's fair criticism. I mean, my story, I saw a couple places, some people offered some pretty blistering feedback that I was too soft on Gary Davidson. And I just was like, hey, that's fair. It's absolutely fair. There's some definite criticism of the job they did. But I thought him as a character was really interesting. And then I think Howard Baldwin is a really interesting character who you've spoken to. And the fact that he was like, yeah, I want to make a movie about Gary Davidson. I thought, okay, I feel like my instincts are kind of right about him as a interesting lead character in this movie that I'm trying to write.
So, and actually, to hint to our audience, Howard's going to make a return appearance on this show coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we're going to sort of get into his very brief dalliance into the World Football League. But I am holding in my hands a tattered but still very much intact copy of Gary Davidson's, I guess you could call it, autobiography, written by a guy in partnership with a guy named Bill Libby, called "Breaking the Game Wide Open." And it's another book that obviously is similarly out of print, but written, to your point, in the moment. It's almost like the perfect, I wouldn't call it the puff piece, but it's almost I wouldn't call it apologetic, a very brash and bravado sort of treatise on how Gary Davidson was taking on the man 3 times over. And if you sort of get into the book, it's kind of like, I ain't done yet. And he kind of was sort of after all this WFL thing. But I mean, so Gary Davidson obviously is a white whale. We're hoping that Howard and a few other folks can get us a little closer to that. But I mean, clearly, if there's any guy who's on the sort of Mount Rushmore of challenger or innovator leagues and whatnot. I mean, between him and Dennis Murphy, the late Dennis Murphy, who's been a guest on our show, who was in cahoots with Gary on a couple of different endeavors, including the ABA and WHA. Probably Howard Baldwin from his WHA exploits as well. And there are a handful of others, but Sports Illustrated, even back in 94, when they did sort of like the top, they did a rundown of like 40 sports people and executives of all time. Number 39 was Gary Davidson. And I think they did it on purpose because he was so specifically responsible, or at least involved in so much of innovation that, in the forms of those leagues that he started, maybe didn't sort of, long, it didn't last long, but the influence of them, I mean, for those who haven't been paying attention, still lives on to this very day, including, for example, where the goalposts reside in the NFL today, et cetera.
Yeah, he is. He had an impact on sports. And I also, I mean, one of the reasons that I was drawn to him was because I feel like, his name shouldn't be lost to history either. I had never heard his name before. And he deserves to sort of be good or bad. And Gary's, when I talk to him, he's open to the criticism. Like he's 87. He's had a successful life. I think he's proud of a lot of the things that they did. And, I think he felt similarly that like, hey, we made a run at the NFL and it didn't work out. And I made some mistakes along the way, but like, I'm pretty proud of just how far we got. And so I think he's comfortable with his legacy, which I just thought, I thought it was kind of cool to kind of bring that back up into people's consciousness, because for all the reasons you're saying, he was like, I mean, I don't know that he was, it's hard to say this, it's almost 45, 50 years ago, but he wasn't maybe like an A-list sports celebrity, but boy, he was close. He was on magazine covers and he held press conferences. And I mean, he knew how to work the media pretty good. And I think even back then, I use the phrase rabble rouser. He was a rabble rouser, man. He was coming at people. He knew, in some ways, this idea of having a brand and being aggressive and outspoken. I mean, he was 40 years ahead of like the social media, Instagram world of like, let me antagonize a little bit because it's good for business. That was Gary Davidson was doing that in the 70s. He was picking fights and he liked being in the fray. And so I think I think that's why I was really interested in him, because there's so many elements of both him and the leagues and his approach that I thought was very much decades ahead of the rest of the world. And now the world has caught up to some of that.
So what did you think you knew about him before you reached out to him? Like the research and what were you sort of in your head? What were you sort of prepared to receive on the other end of the conversation? Because he was sort of a mixed bag character, right? Clearly innovator and pioneer, ahead of his time, challenger, brash, all that stuff. A hustler in the best cases, and even in the worst cases, right? That's a double-edged word, the hustler, as we learned with Dennis Murphy, who embraced the term on both fronts as well. But I mean, did you, when you finally talked to him, right? Did he fulfill the background that you knew about him from your research, or did he surprise you or take you in a different direction?
No, he surprised me as far as like being willing to engage in some of the critical aspects of it. And then I thought he was sort of, I thought he was a ringleader and the person who was in charge of everything. And he kind of like set up that it was more, he was the ownership management person. And then he turned over, especially to John Bassett. I'm sure we'll get to that name quite a bit. He said, you be the talent procurer, and so John Bassett led the charge to get the Miami 3 and other players. And so John Bassett played an active role as the man on the ground and getting players. And so I was a little bit surprised when we talked that Gary was like, yeah, I didn't meet with the Dolphins players, I let John handle that. And that might sound bad, but when you talk to the Dolphins players and other players, the kind words they had for John Bassett was widely respected, and very well liked, and also very rich. He was like an owner that you could rely on, like he's going to make payroll. And so I actually thought it was really interesting, the delegation. I mean, when you're making a run at the NFL, you have to delegate. I don't know that like even like Elon Musk could come in and just like do everything if he wanted to take on a sports league. You would have to find the right perfect person to meet with players. And Gary felt like, hey, John Bassett's the guy, and he was right. So I was kind of surprised. Sometimes it's really interesting when you meet powerful people who are aware that, I might not be as good at X as so-and-so. And so I'm going to put her or him in charge of that. And then they do it. And so I was kind of impressed by that. And I'll tell you one thing that I did not expect, that we had an interesting conversation with, and it's very debatable. Like, there's people that will disagree with this part of the business, but Gary made the case that in retrospect, starting this league in the early to mid 70s, there was parts of American society that were very problematic for a startup NFL league. And he was pointing specifically to, there's a significant economic downturn between 1973 and 1975. Lots of people lost.
Yeah.
And it was a huge factor. And Gary makes the case that was a giant factor. And we also got, he's not as big into this as I kind of got interested, but there's also something to be said for this idea that America was in a post-Nixon, post-Vietnam era where the public became very skeptical of American institutions. And, we think of it primarily through a government lens, but whenever the wheels started to come off with the WFL, and I'm pointing specifically to one incident, which is the idea of lying about paid attendance, which happened in the first month of the season. They had very good attendance the first 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. They had very good attendance, but Philadelphia and I believe one other franchise, they had papered the place. They had let people come for free. And in retrospect, Gary said this, a few people said this. If Philadelphia had just said, yeah, we got 50,000 people, we let them all come for free. We gave out tickets to kids to let them come and see our product. I think there's a good chance they'd be fine. But instead, they propped it up as like we are selling a ton of tickets, and they were not selling a ton of tickets. I think about 20% of the gate was actually paid attendance, and the other 80% was, kind of handing out tickets. And Gary said this, and I tend to think he's right. If they had just said we got 50,000, but it was all free tickets, but hey, we got 50,000 people every week coming to our games. There is interest. We can make this work. They probably would have been fine. But I bring all of that up, and the way that these 2 points connect is I think that that was a real downfall for the WFL when the media felt scammed in the early, mid 70s. They really went all in on oh, you guys are full of it, and this was an era when people, the illusion of trusting government institutions and institutions in general, I think it was on people's minds to be skeptical, and it was sort of a shocking era for that. And so I think the air came out of the tires real quick, and that's what Gary said to me. And I definitely got pushback during the reporting from quite a few people. Upton Bell was just I disagree. I think he thought the attendance thing was a big deal, but that the economic downturn and general American skepticism of institutions were just excuses. And it's a fair point. I don't know what the truth of that is, but I was surprised that all of a sudden I'm talking to this guy, Gary Davidson, about the WFL, and Watergate is in the conversation also. So I think that was probably my most surprising thing that popped up during my conversation with Gary.
Yeah, it's okay. So back to what I said earlier. Not only is there a book here, but a feature length doc, right? Because there are so many layers, and arguably that could be a theme. And I kind of never really sort of put that in my sort of top level of themes, but there's no question, right? The economic background of the times, right? We've seen this in all of our various explorations. Dating back even to, the earliest days of baseball and stuff. Economy matters, right? And discretionary income and oil crisis and gas lines. And if do you have the even or odd numbered plate to get gas that day? Again, I'm dating myself, but that was a reality for a couple of years in the 70s. So it's not unimportant to bring that up. But however, right, I think there's absolutely some specific things going on around that time that I'm sure you figured out and or had questions around. So for example, let's look at the facilities, that they were getting for these teams. And frankly, the locations and the relative breadth of those locations, right? You had at various times in the startup of this, Toronto with Johnny Bassett, Hawaii, right, which was also ahead of its time, but not really a quick flight from the East Coast. You had a New York franchise that, because of Yankee Stadium being offline for renovation, and Shea Stadium going to now host 4 teams simultaneously in 75, really bereft of any suitable facility aside from an absolutely decrepit, and it didn't stop the New York Cosmos the next year in 75 with Pele of all things to use it either on Downing Stadium in Randall's Island, which nobody in New York could get to because it's under the Triborough Bridge, right? So wrapped up in that is, I guess, the approach to franchises. And I really pulled this out when I was talking to Dennis Murphy. It seemed to me, and obviously these are two different guys, but they did overlap, and the influence of this model certainly played out of the WFL. And it came down to kind of this is my summation. It was almost felt like it was sell the franchises first and the supposed scarcity of those, and we'll fill in the blanks and the functionality and the pieces later. And that to me, whether it's Gary Davidson or others related, is the definition of a hustle, right? Maybe that's the way to get it going, right? It's kind of like kindling a fire. But I think corners were cut in trying to get a certain number of franchises and the cities that they, the majorness of the cities with them, despite the fact that there was not a whole lot underneath most of them.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. It's a great point. You can take any amount of money. The actual logistics of putting together a sports league is so difficult, and from the stadium, you're right. This just, okay, I have $500 million. I'm going to start a league. We have plenty of money. Just what cities do you do it in? Do you do it in a city that's already shown an interest in a football team and risk the idea of like, well, we already have the Cleveland Browns. Why would we need the Cleveland whatever? Or do you try for new cities entirely? And they wrestled with that. It's a very bold choice to put a professional sports team in Hawaii, which, it's a great idea. It logistically, man, it was tough. It was really tough. A 5-hour time difference. It's tough to get to Hawaii. And that's why I don't know that you were going to see a Hawaiian pro sports team anytime soon. They ran into all of that stuff. And the stadium deals were just you just gave a tip of the iceberg on what a mess that often was. And when you did find one of these, I don't even know. I was going to say second tier stadium in New York. I don't know. Is there a third or fourth tier? It's probably more like it. Dusty Rhodes talked for 5 or 10 minutes with me just about how bad the lighting was. The players, the lighting was terrible. And players hated that part of it, trying to catch a football like borderline in the dark. And then she said the bathrooms and hallways and locker rooms, they had to light candles just to be able to see. And that just added, in addition to actually being difficult to play football and walk around in the hallways and go to the bathroom at these stadiums, it also just added to the momentum at a certain point a few months into the season that this was just a laugh out loud league. When there's candlelit bathrooms, it just is like, oh my gosh, like, how can I believe this thing's going to work? And so I think there was a real deflation of morale around it, that some of these stadium debacles contributed enormously to.
Well, yeah, and look, and having that be the situation in the nation's biggest market and media market on top of that, right, is not a good look. So that literally whatever else is buffeting the league, such as a paper gate in Philadelphia with the Bell or whatever, right? And when you're fledgling like that, I mean, we had a great conversation with John Sterling about 2 years ago, and his vivid memories of like some of the first games he ever did, and they didn't have a line in there, so they had to call the game in on the phone and hand the phone back and forth on the air. I mean, it was comical in retrospect, but all of this though, to Davidson and his crew's credit, right? This also doesn't happen without a huge buy-in of faith on some level at every functional point in this league, whether it's from the coaching perspective or the players' perspective or the administration, the general management and that kind of stuff, even media, right? The people like the fledgling TVS syndicated television network, Eddie Einhorn and whatnot, right? So not a national television contract per se in a classic 3 or 4 network perspective. Obviously, back in the day, there were only 3 major networks but a syndicated network that was itself fledgling as well. Everybody seemed to be on the. There was a common belief, and the narrative that was built around this, right, shaky as it might have been, ultimately, there seemed to be quite a few people that wanted to challenge the NFL or perhaps take it to new markets or do it better, faster, more fun, more rule innovative, whatever. And the fact that a lot of people believed in that premise, that takes a lot too. It's not just the fancy of one guy.
Yeah. Now the blueprint was there. I mean, it really was. I'll make the case for a minute for how close I think that they came. I think the papering, the crowd thing really, really hit it hurt their credibility really bad. It really was a ding on, okay. Like I said, I think American skepticism was at all-time highs in the early to mid 70s. And so it was just like, another instance in my life of hearing one thing and we find out the truth is something else. I think that was without that. I think that the momentum after 6 or 8 weeks it's a very different vibe. And I also think like one of the things that came up a lot as a criticism of WFL leadership, including Gary, was that they rushed. That the plan originally, I think, was that they'd kick off in 1975, and there was a rush to go a year early, which means they did a bad job of handing out franchise. They had a bunch of owners that I'd say probably about half the owners of the WFL probably had no they shouldn't have been owners. They just shouldn't have been. They didn't have the money. They didn't have, their goals were, I have the money, but I'm just going to make a quick profit a year or two in. And so I think that was a major issue. But the logic of going in 1974, there is a world in which that was brilliant also, because the NFL was on the brink of a work stoppage, and this idea that they could step in and both try to poach players and also fulfill the American need for football. And there's a world in which the work stoppage continues for a long time. And the WFL is all of a sudden providing football nourishment to the public. And unfortunately, I don't know the exact total. Do you know how long did the work stoppage actually go? Was it only a couple of weeks, I think, in 1974? Yeah,
I think that's right. I don't know if it even touched into the actual season, but it was certainly in the air, shall we say, and getting more real by the week.
Like, imagine the WFL with 3 months of the NFL being stopped in August, September, October. I mean, that's a different universe, and so that was one possibility. And then, I didn't devote a lot of time to this, but, I don't know it's hard to tell how serious the Joe Namath thing was, but in all of my interviews, it sure sounded like a possibility that Joe Namath signs with the WFL. And I think that played a key part in the TV deal kind of falling apart. And boy, you throw those things together and, this is definitely revisionist history, but so they don't lie about the crowds. The NFL has a little bit longer of a work stoppage, and Joe Namath does pull the trigger on coming. You throw those things in there, and then all of a sudden the WFL is just on very different footing, and you can kind of see where it works. And so I was really struck by that. In addition to, there was definitely a lot of mistakes that were made. But I would say that when you look at any of these startups, I kind of had in my head the entire time I was writing this. I think you need 3 primary things to take on one of these leagues. One is really good, steady owners that are willing to lose money. I mean, I just can't imagine any of these major sports leagues right now that it wouldn't take at least 3 years of really significant losses before you would show a return. And if you don't have a bunch of people that are willing to hemorrhage money and spend money and not panic, if you don't have people that are willing to do at least 3 years, then you're probably in trouble. So I think that's one huge part, the good, steady owner thing. And then part, I guess 1A on that would be get players. Like, you got to get without the talent, I don't know how you do it, And so if you don't have ownership that's willing to pay players and you can convince them to see your vision and come, I don't know that you can do it. And then I think the last factor that in my head was, I think you just need good luck, to go back to what I was saying 2 minutes ago about some of the bad breaks the WFL had. Sprinkle a little luck dust on there, and maybe some of those things happen and the WFL gets a couple lucky breaks. So I think that even, let's say you wanted to take on the NHL right now and you had great owners who are willing to pay players, a pandemic happens and it might not matter, So I think the luck component of it's not nothing. These leagues that have succeeded, they've had a little bit of luck along the way also. So I think that's critical. And the WFL just, I think, had almost no luck. I think they did some great things, but the luck factor, I don't know. It's hard to look at their there a couple of years and be like, yeah, they got really lucky with X, Y, and Z. There just wasn't much of it.
So we got to find out from Joe Namath, who is luckily still with us, whether that was an actual thing. I don't know if I've ever heard him or ask that question. But look, that also wouldn't surprise, right? Because that is absolutely from the first 2 or 3 pages of the WHA playbook with Bobby Hull, right?
Yep.
And by all accounts, right, the WHA was fledgling and opportunistic, and the NHL was probably even more sort of backward, I guess, than the NFL was at this time, because they had just only recently understood that the idea they could expand beyond 6 franchises around 1967, right? They were years behind the curve on all of that front. And yet, it really took something, spectacularly, intriguing to lure such a major name like that for $1 million check, right? And it doesn't strain logic to think that maybe somebody like a Joe Namath, even with his ailing knees at the time, right, probably would have been exactly the magic pixie dust or elixir, perhaps, to get the casual fan. And I guess that's sort of where it comes into play, right? I mean, all this is about not only challenging the leagues themselves and expanding the pie, but it's also the casual fan too, because it gives them the opportunity to kind of maybe more affordably go to a game. All right, so many different things here, Beck. Number one, we talk about sort of like the idea of a Joe Namath and that kind of thing. It speaks to one of the things that we've sort of teased out with lots of other conversations about other leagues, is this sort of collective sort of league owned kind of setup versus that of a franchise model, right? And clearly the ABA, WHA, the Gary Davidson world was very much the latter. It was a franchise thing where I will sell you franchises on a hint or a whiff of scarcity. You get in on the ground floor, and there'll be value built that way. But of course, the negatives of that become, how do you herd those cats when the league has issues or needs to make centralized decisions, right? It becomes a battle of egos. Now, one of those things that, the WHA was at least able to do, despite them having a franchise model, was at least to agree on getting some collective bucks around luring Bobby Hull, right? So throw money in the kitty. Now, I'm going to give our audience a bit of a tip off in our next conversation with Howard Baldwin coming up. I asked him specifically that question, and he kind of said some of the franchises did the collective thing and put the money in, but there were a whole bunch that didn't. And that speaks volumes, right? Because if you're going to take one for the team, or you're going to try to get this league up and running, the all or nothing thing already starting to break when people are hemming about paying for the best hockey player on the planet at the time. Folks were already saying no thanks, even though it was going to be to their betterment and to the league's functionality early on.
Yeah. Any of these startups, you're going to spring leaks. You're going to have like an owner who has a problem, or a team that gets kicked out of its stadium or whatever. And that means everybody else has to be steady and kind of hold the line. And it just wasn't there for the WFL. The league ownership had some money and was able to, I have an anecdote in there about how Detroit is, oh my goodness. They had 30 plus owners. There are multiple franchises in the WFL that like are potentially among, like, if you made a top 25 of the worst run franchises in sports history, they're in the running. And Detroit for sure was one of them. But the league heard that players had not been paid in quite some time. And so Gary told this anecdote about sending a courier with checks for about half of what the players were owed. So whatever, if they were owed $1,000, he sent checks for $500. And the courier shows up in the locker room and starts giving out all the checks. And the minute the players realized it was half the money, they roughed up the courier. They were so frustrated by even just getting half the money. And so that was an instance of the league trying to step in and cobble together. But there were too many leaks and not enough steady hands. There was only so much John Bassett and some of the other owners could do. there were some good owners, Bassett being one. There were multiple other owners that were really steady, and that's why. I mean, Gary got run off. I mean, let's be honest. He resigned. I think it was technically considered a resignation, but like he was heading out, and it was time for him to go at the end of that first year. Not even at the end of the first year, like toward the end of the first year. The Chicago owner specifically was pretty frustrated with him, and so he eventually got run off, and it was too late. They just did not have enough ownership backbone. I think like I say this at a time when like multiple NFL owners still are kind of under fire for terribly run organizations, but you can't have more than a couple of really big potholes in one of these leagues, and they just had too many, and it eventually capsized the whole thing.
So, I mean, you have to give him some credit, though, and Davidson in particular, right? So, I mean, ahead of his time, right? I think one of those areas is new markets, right? So I'm sure back in the day, the conversation goes around, okay, well, we need some franchises in some of the big media markets so we get some attention, right? So you can't not ignore a Chicago or New York, or I'm sure LA was, with which ultimately became the Sun, the Southern California Sun, right? But then there's also sort of rich, fertile football interest, right, in largely college, strong towns like a Memphis or a Birmingham, right, along on the list of forlorn and forgotten or go to markets, and have the football literally and figuratively taken away by the holder of Lucy and the Peanuts, I guess. Charlotte, right? Upton Bell, right? Yeah. Moving New York to Charlotte, and Florida, even Orlando, and those, those were arguably very much ahead of their time too. But you can already see, again, in hindsight, how challenging that can be, because you're marketing a product to big cities that have the real thing, and the comparisons that immediately come, and the attention difficulties, because there is so much other sports going on of a top tier for many, many years, married with a whole bunch of new, franchises in markets that kind of didn't really even have any other pro sports going on for them.
Yeah.
Those are two different situations in the same league. It becomes kind of mongrel-like when you're trying to, I guess, sell the big story.
Yeah. That's a really interesting topic about the idea of, we still don't, I mean, we have 50 more years of data about like which communities will support a sports team, which ones won't, but we still don't know completely, where fan bases are going to show up. I mean, there's still debate about, several big time sports teams and communities about their level of support. And Gary and that crew that started some of these leagues in the early 70s, they were pretty good in retrospect. The WFL was probably their weakest showcase, the weakest case for their vision of like, no, a team will work here. But when you think about it, there's 4 NBA teams that were, ABA creations, right? Like I think it was the Nuggets, the Nets, the Pacers, and the Spurs were all absorbed into the NBA, and that was them scouting out like, no, I think San Antonio can handle having a professional basketball team, and so they got a lot of it right. And Charlotte is actually a good example of a team that I'm not sure what the presence of professional sports were in Charlotte in the early 70s, but it has definitely spiked. And I think part of that goes to the Davidson crew and Upton Bell. I think Upton Bell is a big proponent of Charlotte. He really was that we spent a lot of time in our conversation talking about how when he moved the New York team down there, he just always thought there was a insatiable appetite for sports there, and that they could do it. And he was right. I mean, it didn't work out with his version of the Charlotte team, but he was right about scouting out that community. There's just so many factors in, I mean, I've been in some conversations over the years just about the idea of professional football in Los Angeles. It's like it has had a sordid history, and professional football in Los Angeles seems like just well, of course that'll work, right? And then it has had its significant ups and downs. So I consider, when I looked at the total resume of Gary Davidson, that he had a lot more success than failure when it came to identifying communities that were going to work. On the flip side, the logic for putting a team in Hawaii is really tough. It's really tough from a fan base, from a logistics perspective. And so that was one we had kind of a good laugh about, just that the concept in general of this, like, let's start up a league and we'll immediately put a team in Hawaii, and just there, it was almost a guaranteed not to work. And sure enough, it did not.
All right, what's this? How about sportshistorycollectibles.com? Oh, boy. We love sportshistorycollectibles.com. You've heard us talk about it forever since we began this show. One of our earliest sponsors, our pal Dean Mitchell, out in San Diego. And as the name implies, it's memorabilia from all those leagues and teams that came and went and thrived and failed, but nevertheless shaped the North American sports landscape of today. And if you're looking for ticket stubs or mini helmets, DVDs, pennants, jackets, even newspapers, or stadium replicas, magnets, schedules, media guide, you name it. It's all there for you at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we're talking about the best in forgotten sports history, in basketball and soccer and football and baseball and hockey and all kinds of miscellaneous sports like tennis and racing, the stadiums, the Olympics even. Just amazing stuff. And, you probably have eBay on your brain when you're thinking about looking for some of those items out there. And sure, eBay's pretty darn good, I guess. And there's, of course, some high-end auction sites out there, too, for sure. But sportshistorycollectibles.com is unique in that it focuses on those things that this here podcast is obsessed about, which are things that aren't around anymore, in particular teams and leagues and various related ephemera. And the good stuff is also highly photographed and well described, so you know what you're getting, and the prices really can't be beat. You don't have to worry about losing out on bids at the last minute and all that kind of stuff. And trust me, Dean's got stuff that you're looking for, and is getting new stuff, not new stuff, but new old stuff, like inventory. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. All kinds of refreshed inventory all the time. So it's just a sight to behold. So you'll lose hours of time just looking and ogling, if you will, digitally, the items from your childhood or from various followings of teams that you might have just plain old forgotten. And to see those items there for you and well photographed, you're gonna be amazed. Then, after looking at more than a few of them, you're gonna say, "Gosh, I gotta have me one or a bunch of them." And that's where our promo code comes in handy, and that's Good Seats. A promo code Good Seats for you at sportshistorycollectibles.com for 15% off all of your purchases. Again, our thanks to Dean Mitchell and his pals at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your purchases. As they say, you'll be glad you did. Thanks, Dean, for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Well, he did have ambitions. The word world was in the league, right? And
sure,
at least a Canadian franchise, and I'm sure a bit of vision, not unlike what the NFL has realized over the years since, right? That there, and frankly, I think the future of the NFL depends on exactly this, which is international markets. Now, how do you tap into that? The NFL's had dalliances with like the World League of American Football and those kinds of things, but it's clear that the next phase of growth for that league is to internationalize it. And that probably means franchises in places like Mexico and England and Canada and all the, and I'm sure there was a slight vision, I guess, that Hawaii was the gateway to Asia in some respects. Mm-hmm. But, you don't think these things through, I guess, when you're just trying to get people to cough up the dough and just say yes so we can put a franchise on the map.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So, all right, a couple of things here. So clearly, one of the other sort of hooks that Davidson went to, which was successful in the ABA and the WHA playbooks, and that was antitrust, right? And players' rights and the ability to kind of tackle, literally, if you will, the idea of the closed and perhaps illegally favored setup of the NFL, whether it be, a player's rights to move and ability to, get fair market value for their services and that kind of stuff. And there's no question that always became sort of in the foreground, or certainly always in the background, that sort of, shall we say, legal threat, that antitrust threat, that regulatory threat that, made people pay attention whether they wanted to or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he had a good background in the law himself. And then he had very smart attorneys around him. And they also were very aggressive. I think the challenge to the WHA and the way that, the way that they bound players to teams, that was the most successful in court. But that was like a big story back then. I mean, this was 50 years ago. And so the idea of player empowerment, I mean, I say in the story, he was 50 years ahead of his time on player empowerment. And I think that NHL challenging the NHL's reserve clause was a real shot across the bow for the other sports leagues. And then they didn't always win legally. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes that got me interested in this story, and then I included it, was John Matuszak, who was the number one pick in the NFL draft in 1973. And he was one of the first guys that was just like, wow, you're going to pay me $15,000 to play as the number one pick. And there was some shenanigans I read his book. John Matuszak, by the way, most people listening to this podcast probably remember him from the movies and TV shows he was in. Specifically, he was in The Goonies as Sloth, the character Sloth. He had a very interesting second chapter to his life as sort of a Hollywood, not an A-lister, but like he was on the list. So he was in a lot of movies and TV shows and things like that. But he was a wild man. And so when he came into the NFL, he signed a contract where I think it was roughly, with a signing bonus, it was like 3 years, $100,000 total. And he just couldn't believe that that was not. I mean, I forget if you account for inflation and all of that, what it would be equal to. It was a good living, definitely, for the United States in the early 1970s, but it was also, he just couldn't believe how poorly they were being played. And so he had a really interesting thing where he was haggling with management for that whole first year of his career. He signed his deal and was off to an okay start in the NFL in 1973. And then in 1974, in his book, the way he portrays it is, when he heard about the WFL and some of the deals they were giving out, and the work stoppage happened, he gave his pads and equipment to one of his teammates and said, "I'm leaving, the Houston NFL franchise, and I'm going across town to play for the Houston WFL franchise," which was called the Houston Texans. And so he did. He went across town, signed a deal with them. I forget the dollar figures, but it was considerably more. He was supposed to be paid as a WFL player, but it was the Oilers, right? The Houston Oilers at the time. They challenged it. They said, "Hey, you're under contract for us, work stoppage or not." And so I think he made it like 7 plays into his WFL career before some cops and lawyers, according to a couple of accounts, showed up on the sideline, pulled him out of the game mid-game, like a couple of drives into the game. And the crowd was booing and yelling at Matuszak, and he just looked up at the crowd and said, "Hey, what do you want me to do? They're like legally not allowing me to go back into the game." And so he never played another snap in the WFL. He was under contract and bound by it. But the WFL was in such a renegade headspace that they were like, "So what? Go, let's do it. Anybody wants to come over, come over." And I think a lot of it wouldn't have held up in court, but they were fearless and aggressive, and it worked. It got media attention, and then they found some cracks in the system. The Dolphins, to go off on a tangent about the Dolphins for a second, it was one of the most interesting part of this whole thing is that, wow, in the middle of an NFL dynasty in the mid 1970s, the Dolphins players, 2 Hall of Famers, sign contracts to play out their last season in the NFL and then jump ship over to go to the WFL. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't even imagine a modern equivalent, which is not really a fair comparison to make, but I just couldn't imagine, like, oh my goodness, that happened. Did this actually happen? I need to double check this. And sure enough, it did. So, like, you ask about the legality stuff, but I just, from a legal and even just the general principle of, like, we're coming after you, guns blazing. It just drew me in, and they just didn't care if they ended up in a courtroom or getting yelled at on the front pages of newspapers. The WFL, they were going to go for it.
Yeah, I mean, you're mentioning two stories there: the Larry Csonka Jim kick, and the mini, the going to Memphis, and then the John Matusek story, right? You know, mid game, right? I mean, just the cops coming out or whatever, however he was removed, right? Each of them, you could say, is sort of the quintessential story that sort of writ small kind of describes the overall wackiness of the World Football League. And that's just, by the way, in the first season, or its first incarnation. Many people forget, frankly, that the second year of the league was actually a brand new league altogether.
Yeah.
But the irony, the joke is that there's at least a couple of dozen of these stories, right? And it's almost unfair if you're sort of trying to put together a storyline, because these stories are not only hard to believe, but they were voluminous. Perhaps more so than any other, I think, modern day sports story of its kind.
Yeah, it really was one after the other. Just, how could this be true? How can this be true? Like Upton Bell, I don't know if you want to get into it at all, but Upton Bell was approached. Well, the Paul Sasso part of this story, I mean, I think Paul Sasso could be a movie the more I've read about this guy. But, you know, Upton Bell told me a story that I included about how Charlotte was really on the ropes. I mean, every team was on the ropes by 1975. Everybody was just paddling for dear life. And Charlotte was hurting, and Upton Bell was pretty outspoken about, like, we need help. We need some reinforcements here. And he had gotten pretty disenfranchised with the WFL league ownership. I mean, Davidson was technically gone, but he was kind of a presence up until the day the league folded. He was sort of the spirit animal of this entire league, whether he was the day-to-day commissioner or not. He was still around and a part of it. And so, you know, Upton Bell was very outspoken about, like, hey, when is the cavalry going to come here? And he got a call one day, and it's unbelievable. I verified as much of it as possible. But he got a call one day from this guy who said, hey, I live in Tennessee. I want to come down. I want to meet with you. I want to invest a bunch of money in the team. I have some big ideas that I want, but I'm legit. My name is Paul Sasso, and I'd love to come meet with you. And Upton Bell was very desperate, and he said, okay, let's do it. So the guy came down and met with him, and right away Upton described the vibe was not great. It felt very much like a scene out of an old mob movie. He felt very, a lot of big guys around Paul Sasso, and Paul Sasso's, was pretty succinct about, I think Upton asked him, hey, what do you do for a living? And he said, like a Sopranos type, I work in construction management, something like that. And Upton Bell got a bad vibe almost right away, but this was also somebody that could potentially save the franchise with money. And so he listened to him. And one of the first things that this guy, Paul Sasso, said to him was, I want to build a new stadium, and I want it to be an underground stadium. And he folded out this piece of paper, and Upton Bell was just thinking, I think he said, what the bleep is an underground stadium? He didn't say that out loud because there was a lot of big dudes standing around Paul Sasso. Many of them he thinks might have had guns on them. And so he got this really bad vibe from Paul Sasso, but he had the meeting, he heard the guy out, and then shortly thereafter, he found out the truth about Paul Sasso, which is that he was in the witness protection program, relocated by the FBI to Tennessee. And somehow, I don't know all the details on this, somehow Paul Sasso talked the FBI into letting him use the private jet, which he got in and flew down to meet with Upton Bell. And so everything about this guy fell off to Upton Bell, and he was right about it. It turns out that Paul Sasso was in the witness protection program. He eventually, I've never heard of people that get kicked out of the witness protection program, but that happened. Paul Sasso was booted out of the witness protection program. Accounts vary on why exactly, but a lot of it is that Paul Sasso was a lifelong con man who was associated with the mob on some level, but almost everybody in his orbit, from other mob members to the FBI, learned pretty quickly, like, we don't know what's true and what's not about this guy. And so Upton Bell did not take Paul Sasso's money, and Paul Sasso went back to Tennessee before he was kicked out of the witness protection program. And, sadly, I guess, Paul Sasso was eventually found dead in the trunk of a car. And it's hard to tell exactly how that came to be. But some of the obituaries, if you want to Google them, it's a wild description of this guy's life. The fact that he was in a room talking to a WFL owner about being an investor is just beyond comprehension. But that speaks to the level of desperation for this league. And it also is just, you said there's this pile of anecdotes about the league. There really are. I mean, you could just go on and on and on. Like I said, the Wikipedia page was like, wait a second, this is a Hollywood screenwriter wrote this Wikipedia page. And no, they did not. It was most of it appears to be true.
I believe, and in particular with this league, because it was so short and there are still some people around who were there and original participants. I actually, there's plenty of stories left to uncover or unearth. Certainly there is video to unearth still. People forget that besides the fledgling TVS television network, and we had one of the original directors and producers of those games from a couple of years ago, talking about the hijinks around Howard Zuckerman, who told of stories of they'd have the truck literally in the middle of the country, not knowing which game they were going to go to because there were so many franchises that were either going sideways or moving. So, for example, the Stars moving hastily to Charlotte, or Detroit kind of folding, and all that kind of, it's Shreveport inheriting the Texans. I mean, it was literally that sort of seat of the pants. I mean, there's so many stories, and I'm sure. I mean, I think Howard actually shared some of those that were not known before. I think we got a little bit of publicity on some of the things there. But I mean, all right, so we could go on forever, and I'd love to, and I'm sure you'd like to do that at some point. But let me sort of maybe round up with this one, and it's something I've sort of seen in all my readings and stuff. I don't think you touched on it too much, but I think that it wouldn't have been too difficult to kind of maybe think about it or scratch the surface, or maybe you're a follow-up piece, because arguably the 1975 season could be its own follow-up piece. But I digress. In your opinion, in your knowledge, maybe you don't have any on it, or maybe I'm just sort of I want to say making it up, but certainly maybe sort of expanding on an idea that maybe is not sort of real. But was there, to your knowledge, any, shall we say, untoward efforts or espionage or things behind the scenes going on from the NFL as the WFL was going on? Because I remember a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, there was this persistent item on eBay that one could get. This was sort of before really the internet was sort of like so blazing fast as it is now. It was literally purported to be, and I actually paid $10 to get it, and I still have it, was this sort of printout, like a report that was supposedly put together or administered or ordered by the NFL to get dirt, if you will, on the WFL. And depending on who you talk to, there's a belief that the NFL was more worried than they were letting on, and were trying some very interesting things behind the scenes, not a lot of people admitting, to kind of undermine and or figure out ways to corner or somehow otherwise sabotage the WFL. Does that ring a bell in any of your reporting?
Well, even people like Gary said, their perspective was that the NFL was worried, and Csonka, I mean, Csonka and Warfield and Kick, they played an entire year in the NFL, before they went to the WFL, with everyone knowing they were leaving. So they had that final season. And I talked to them about that idea a little bit. And what's interesting is the only thing I got to as far as the NFL's role in sort of counterattacking was that they definitely behind the scenes worked other media members to let them know every misstep that the WFL made. I think that most of the reporters that covered the WFL at the time were probably doing NFL stuff also, and so they were trying to work the same sources in the NFL. But the thing that Gary and multiple other people said, including Upton Bell, who's a pretty I don't know if I'd call him a critic of Gary, but he definitely has some like critical thoughts about Gary Davidson's management style and some of the missteps for sure. But one of the things they said is just the WFL started tripping over its own feet immediately. Like the NFL barely had to do anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point.
That's what they said. And that's kind of what I uncovered. And I didn't go too deep on calling any NFL people to kind of, one of the things you realize about this story is that most of the people doing it are in their late 70s to 100 years old, in that range. And so it was sourcing is tough on this. And I think the NFL might, this is more theory than fact. I just think the NFL just stood back and watched and maybe giggled at a bar with one of the other New York Times reporters and said like, oh yeah, the team you put on the front page 3 weeks ago, they lied about their entire crowd. Are you going to print anything about that? And so there was some momentum of the media within 6 to 8 weeks. We're talking about a month and a half or so where the coverage had completely turned. And I think there's a really good chance that the NFL they just whispered things like, hey, did you see, how bad that team looked, or the ticket sales, or you have to use candles to use the bathroom at New York games. So I kind of think my prevailing hypothesis would be that the NFL realized pretty quickly, like, we don't actually have to do much to watch this thing spiral out of control.
I think there's a lot to that. It didn't really take much, but I do think that the real sort of story to kind of uncover there, maybe some NFL executives of yore would want to talk about it sort of after the fact, is to really get to just how worried the league office was about this thing. And maybe that purported document that was on eBay for many years, was certainly done in preparation. I think this was certainly before the league got going, right? But the idea of changing some of the rules and starting a season in the summer and some of the markets that perhaps were maybe on the drawing board or in the developmental office of the NFL back then, it's the whole antitrust thing for sure, right? I'm sure alarm bells were of a certain level going on at the NFL because, I think there's also something to it. And I think Howard Baldwin mentioned this in our previous conversation, is that remember too that this was fairly close on the heels of the full absorption of the AFL into the NFL from, I guess it concluded, or the process concluded in 1970, right? So here we are only 4 years later, and here we are again challenging. And I got to think the NFL is like, oh my God, here's another one. And we got to take this one seriously too. Look what happened the last time. But perhaps maybe it was also a little too early on the back of that, because I don't know. It's a lot of revisionist history, I'm sure.
It's really interesting. I spent time talking to Csonka and Warfield because I wondered about that last year and what sort of panic levels they detected. And neither one of them seemed like I was pretty surprised actually that, I detail in the story Csonka calling from John Bassett's office to say, hey, I'm signing this deal. He promised Don Shula, before I sign anything, I'm going to call you. But those three players, Jim Kick, Paul Warfield, and Larry Csonka, they sat with John Bassett. They loved what he had to say. They loved the idea of living and playing in Toronto. They all really thought the community was cool. And so they were sitting there. It was a foregone conclusion. They were going to sign the contract. And just out of respect and following through on his promise, Larry Csonka called. It was funny. Bassett was trying to talk him out of even calling. He just wanted him to sign the contract. And Shula then was trying to talk him out of signing the contract, within a span of a couple of minutes. But Csonka called and he said, "Hey, this is what they're offering me." I mean, it was a lot of money. It was over $1 million. And the money was bonkers. And they Csonka said to me, it was life-changing money. It wasn't just like a upgrade on salary. It was like life-changing money. It set the table for my family for the next few generations of Csonkas. He's pretty adamant about that. And he called Shula, and Shula was disappointed. And Csonka, they all signed their contracts. And then I wondered what happened next. I thought, boy, you had to get back to your life. These guys played another year in the NFL, and they knew every other question was going to be about like the idea they were only X number of days or weeks or games from being out of the league. And I thought for sure there was going to be some sort of intense pressure and panic. And they just didn't say there was. And it's a little surprising. It was quite surprising to me, because I thought in retrospect, the Dolphins were, they were a dynasty. That 72 team will go down as one of the, no matter what. I guess it's possible in my lifetime we see another NFL team go undefeated. But even then, they're going to go down as a team that's the only one to do it in a long, whatever number of years. And the idea that a couple of future Hall of Famers were going to jump, I just thought it was going to set off widespread panic. And at least they didn't feel that, And so I just didn't get, you're right. The thing that you're saying about, the NFL had to be doing things, it may very well be true, to try to tank this thing. I just didn't uncover it. And I actually, to go one step further, talking to the players, I just was surprised there wasn't more chatter, nonstop chatter of like, oh my God, what are we going to do? They're coming for us. And they just didn't say that was the case.
Yeah, very interesting. I wonder too, Shula, if he was, if it was more of trying to talk him out of it from a loyalty perspective, or maybe his inkling that this league wasn't really going to take off and you would be making a big mistake.
Yeah. Well, to go back to something you were saying earlier, they did have all sorts of debacles getting into stadiums and playing, and when can we have games and all of that stuff. And I think there's a really strong case that the NFL was just saying to some of the stadiums and some of the big business people that were kind of relying upon the NFL, hey, don't start flirting with this other league. Like, you got us, and we're gonna be. You see the trajectory of this league. And so there was definitely an undercurrent of, I wonder if they're sort of carefully leveraging behind the scenes to make it really hard for us to actually get stadium deals. I think that it's a big deal that may have been the case. So you can just see, you just imagine this NFL kind of just gently nudging, like, hey, before you start flirtations, just remember where your bread is buttered. We're a steady thing. And so I definitely think those things conspired to kind of keep a little wind in the WFL's face.
Yeah, I think if you look at all the various franchises over the 2 years or year and a half or year and 3/4 of the league, only I think Chicago with Soldier Field and the Astrodome with Houston were the only shared facilities. The rest were either new markets altogether, like Jacksonville, and the Gator Bowl is another market that was ahead of its time, so to speak, or not in the same stadia that housed the NFL team, like a Downing Stadium in New York, for example, or Franklin Field in Philadelphia, right, or Anaheim Stadium in LA, right? I was in Orange County, not even in LA, where the Rams were playing at the time. So it's clear that some of that was certainly happening. All right, well, here's my very last question. Is there any people that you wish you could have been able to find, either being alive today or not alive, that you thought maybe could have really opened up the door for this story? I mean, I think Gary Davidson is probably, the best, and the fact that you were able to get him and to go deep on it, and he has some level of clarity of mind, which is, is terrific. But are there any other people that you just wish, magic wand wise, you could have gotten to go deeper in the story, to maybe unlock a few still mysteries?
I'll give you two. One has passed away a long time ago. John Bassett. John Bassett had an incredible role in this. And I think that there's a version of this story, if John Bassett's alive, where you just write it about John Bassett and his impact. Because he was really the orchestrator of getting the talent. Like, he was the one meeting with players. And, there were even rumors of Bassett helping court players for other teams. He wanted the WFL to succeed. And so if Toronto/Memphis couldn't get them, then he wanted to. And I write in the story about, like, he developed this friendship. It was hard to tell how deep the friendship went, but he was hanging out with Elvis Presley on a certain level, and it's like going to concerts. And Upton Bell told this story about John Bassett, welcoming Elvis Presley to Memphis football games. And then Elvis said, come to some of my concerts. And so he went to Upton, told a story about John Bassett. Elvis comes out on stage and says, I want to thank my friend John Bassett, and lobbed the football off the stage toward John Bassett. And it's just like, wow, I would have liked to have experienced the charisma that could talk Miami Dolphins into coming to the league, and also become buddy with Elvis Presley. So I would have loved to have gotten John Bassett.
He was also the longtime spirit and the anti-Trump of the USFL too.
Yeah.
So there's whole other story there.
Yeah. Just chapter after chapter. And then how he got his money and his battle. I mean, one of the staggering things about Bassett was just this idea. He was like, he was kind of a legend in Toronto, very well regarded and liked. But boy, the minute he started talking about putting an NFL team there, it really went over like a lead balloon. And Canadian Parliament pretty quickly flexed and said, if you do that, we are going to pass a measure that would not allow that. They thought it would be damaging to the CFL. And so they were pretty aggressive about that. And so the idea of being this local legend, well-respected, and having that big flare up of tension, that was also something very interesting to me. And then I guess, the entire, I could have written this story potentially where it's a Joe Namath story, how true was it? And I did not get a hold of Joe Namath. And I kind of wish I had, but I also know that I really did believe that to tell this story, I wanted to have a central character. And once I started talking to Davidson, I thought he was really interesting, and I wanted to go that route. But if you said go back and do it again, how would you do it differently? Maybe it's a Joe Namath story, I don't know how true. Maybe this was just a leverage play. I don't know. Maybe it's 5% truth to it. But when I was talking to Howard Baldwin and Gary, they really thought there was a chance they were going to get Namath, and so did the TV provider. And so even if you do a story where Joe Namath tells you that it was I wasn't going to leave the NFL. Come on, Brian. Even if he tells you that, there's still sort of a version of this story that's pretty interesting. As he could have potentially been a savior for this thing. So I guess if I were starting from scratch, I would love to somehow have dinner with John Bassett, or potentially explore a heavy Joe Namath story.
Well, look, regardless of that, right? This is a screamingly interesting piece. It begs for a part two. It begs for a book treatment. It begs for even a documentary film treatment. And, I know you've got your own distractions and your own sort of passions and other things to get to. But if you're looking for a vote of confidence for any of those embellishments of this piece, which itself is fantastic, you certainly have it from me, and I'm sure a whole lot of listeners of this conversation, of this episode, because I do believe there's plenty more there. And I think in many respects, it's almost as timely as today's headlines, when we see, again, 2 new challenger leagues stepping up to their plate, taking some swings at the man. It's just football just seems to intrigue people. There always seems to be people who believe that there is more opportunity, and maybe in this era where streaming and big stadiums or lots of extra stadia for lots of extra things to fill, and sports and leisure time and the big money now behind it, even more so than it's ever been. Don't know. It just seems as relevant as ever, to learn about not only the innovations of what came before it, but maybe the watch outs for what not to do, and recognizing that history in many cases actually repeats itself.
Sure. Well, what do you think? What do you think would it take for a league to kind of challenge the NFL and be successful?
Wow. I get to answer a question. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm curious. You spent a lot of time on this topic. I consider you.
Well, what do I know? But I think, I guess it feels to me like at this time in history, in terms of how much of a big business sports has become. I mean, we're talking things like private equity and an acquiescence, I guess, around gambling and sports, which was so taboo for such a long period of time. And by the way, what could go wrong with that again? We'll see. Just the sheer magnitude of the money involved, especially when it comes to leveraging or hijacking or somewhere in between cities to get new stadiums or threaten to move and all that kind of stuff, the high stakes nature of that. Media, television, maybe not sort of as powerful as it used to be, but certainly streaming is, and 1,000 niches blooming, and the economic support of a niche can actually be foundational enough revenue wise versus a big broadcast television contract. To me, it feels like there's ample opportunity, not only for, let's call them alternate football leagues, but also all kinds of alternate sports that have never risen to the pro level, or maybe renewed efforts like indoor soccer, sort of, again, like the old MISL back in the day. I know there's the MASL now, but it's more minor league relative to what could be pro. To answer your question specifically, I think it's probably more of a either an alignment, or I don't want to say the word feeder, but some kind of a part of the overall NFL complex where another league or two could sort of live on, right? I think flag football, which has a bit of an investment from the NFL, could be an aligned league that stands alone by itself, but also is a skill developer for the big show. I think something in the spring, whether it's a merger of whatever this USFL thing, I'd like to think of it as the spring league with a new coat of paint from still questionable intellectual property means, and the next version of the XFL. Let's assume that kind of combines. I do think there's room for spring football, right? As a direct challenger or competitor, no, but as an aligned relationship, maybe with the NFL, either formally or not. As I said earlier, plenty of talent out there, and there is no minor league football system, right? College is essentially the minor leagues, right? So the G League may be a model that the NFL could, perhaps adjunct by whatever sort of succeeds, let them do all the hard work and the pioneering, and the NFL could invest in it and take it over time. And I think the other part, as I hinted at before, is international, right? So that I think the NFL literally can't go much further than the current models allow it to, aside from incremental growth and inflation, that kind of stuff, but absolutely international markets. And the NFL has proven that they haven't been able to do it on their own yet. So it might take either some seed money from them or some other renegade in the vein of a Gary Davidson to create either in cahoots with, or at least understanding the NFL's needs to start developing these other markets. I mean, the NBA is doing it with the Africa League. It's absolutely got to be the next thing to do. So the long-winded way of saying, I think the answer is yes, there's room for it. It's not another NFL or a challenger two. I think it's more of an alignment with or a feeder to that can be ingredients for either expansion of the thing geographically, or to enhance the skill set of what comes into the league, and maybe even replacing some aspects of the college game, which are, I would argue, going sideways on a whole bunch of different levels. How about that as an answer?
Yeah. No,
What do you think? I mean, do you think any of these leagues are going to live on? Do you think arena football could come back? I mean, there's another skill set, I mean, I know it was kind of a show, but a lot of players like to play it, and it's fun to watch.
I think everything you said is there's truth to that. And I can't imagine, I was going to ask you spring versus fall. I just don't see another league being able to start up in the fall. I just think that's one thing that WFL thought they'd get out of the gates in. I think they started playing games in like mid to late June. We'll get out of the gates in a couple of weeks, but then they were going head to head against the NFL. And I just don't, it's too entrenched. The NFL isn't the most popular sport in the United States. It's the most popular thing. When you look at the most watched things every year, it's not even close. Like the NFL is there's no, there's no TV show
propping up television. It's propping up live television and live broadcast television. I mean,
from advertising to ratings,
you got it.
Yeah. So it would have to be spring, and I think the USFL. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I do think there is a loose affiliation right now, right, between the USFL and the NFL. I think there's some. I don't know all the details on it, but so I think you're right. Like sort of syncing up somehow is probably essential. The one thing I would just say is I just don't know how anybody would ever have success without like getting 5 great players. If you told me Elon Musk convinced Mark Cuban to come in on a spring football league, and they talked to Aaron Rodgers and 4 other all-pros, and they're going to come and be in the initial startup of this, and they each get 25% of the franchise, blah, 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 blah. I could see that. I don't know if you're ever going to really make a dent if you have a bunch of guys that could have been 5th-round NFL draft picks, but instead came to your league. Like, I just think that there'd have to be a big splashy, like to go back to, I talked about MMA earlier. Like if somebody wants to take on the UFC, I think you got to sign like Conor McGregor and 3 other really elite fighters, even if they're at the end of their career, and say, these are A-list people, come see them perform. And so I don't know. I think that's kind of the X factor. Like if you don't have that, I just don't know how you make it work. I guess you could have a bunch of really wild owners that make you really interested. I don't know. But I do think the talent thing is just, I don't know how you ever do it without having, like, I probably shouldn't even say this, but I don't know if I could name a single USFL player. They're playing games right now. I don't know if I know a single guy that is in the league. And I think that's a problem.
Correct. And how long will it take to build those stories? And, it still remains to be seen, right? Certainly there aren't many fans. I mean, they came out for that first game with Birmingham, but, there's a whole lot of intrigue there. So, in some respects, we've sort of seen this movie before, but there's a reason why people keep taking shots at it again. And I think even more so than ever, more than any other era in modern day pro sports history, is that the money now is at such an exponentially larger level now. It's gone sports is really kind of intersected with so many other things, like certainly commerce, but real estate. Look at now the model for, there's no team now in any of the major leagues that doesn't want or desire its own stadium, to the exclusion perhaps of any other sports team in their market, because they want to fully control their own revenue streams, to the point of buying up and or building around said location for other means, just as a mixed use development project, right? Look at what Truist Park in Atlanta is doing. It's literally in a suburb. It's like a suburban, I don't know. It's a suburban Disneyland concoction, if you will. I don't call business buildings, commercial buildings, Disneyland. But essentially, it's its own little walled off world, if you will, that you know, or the buying around Wrigley Field in Chicago, right? I mean, it's just become the Cubs zone. And, you know, even if it's out of season, come skate next to the park, you know, stay at the hotel across the street where the McDonald's used to be. I mean, the Bears are moving into Arlington Heights, probably. I mean, they're going to probably do the same thing. So sports has, I won't say it's perverted, but it's certainly metastasized into something far more economically complex, different, and of a scale that you know, belies some of the little stories that we talk about the past, right? And I just, there's too much money involved now and globalization of the sport that people are still just not going to stop trying to get their piece of it. And look, I think there's also a whole bunch of people out there that are that look at the NFL as being it's at its peak. It's not going to get any better than that. And when CTE and the economics and labor issues and you know, and cities and municipalities pushing back somehow on being held up for these stadiums and tax money and all that stuff, I think there are a bunch of people who think that it can't go anywhere but down from here. So, you know, well, as long as these conversations still exist, I guess we'll keep podcasting because it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. Because in many respects, history repeats itself, and we love to go back and rediscover, or frankly, for the first time, discover that some of these issues are actually maybe writ smaller, not necessarily new, but as timely as they ever were. So, and case in point, this story, the WFL, and hopefully others to come from you, Ryan.
Can I throw one more? Can I throw one more
Please.
curveball at you?
Go ahead.
I thought about this a lot as I was working on this WFL story. Do you do Wordle? You know what Wordle is?
Oh, sure, of course.
Okay, Wordle. So Wordle came along, I don't know, what, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, something like that. I've played it for about 4 months now. And as I was doing it, I thought, wow, what's this Wordle thing? And then I started playing it. And the first time I did it, I was like, oh, that was really fun. And then I couldn't believe they made me wait till midnight to do it again. And I thought, what a disastrous idea. You should be able to just go on and just do Wordle over and over again. I can't tell you how wrong I was about that. It created sort of a scarcity intrigue to come back the next day. I mean, I know a bunch of people that would do it at 12:01 a.m. because they got really into it. And there was something about that piqued people's interest and made them wait. And they had an appetite for it, but it wasn't. I think there's a chance that a lot of people would have played Wordle, done it 37 times on day one and not done it again. And so as I was working on this WFL story, it really made me think about, you know, the NFL is year round at this point, sort of in its interest. You know, we're talking about the draft right now, but I did wonder, could there be football games on 12 months a year and I would want to watch them? And I don't know. Or even 10 months a year. And it made me wonder if the NFL, the amount of games that they have right now, is it the peak amount? I mean, we're up to 17 regular season games with, you know, an extra play. Is there an extra playoff round? Yeah, they added a playoff team. I just wondered, even if the USFL was super exciting, would I be ready to be starting up on football games again? And so the Wordle thing really made me think hard about the idea of being hungry for something, but only hungry for the right amount, you know?
Scarcity versus saturation.
Yeah. I mean, if there were good football on 10 months a year, do you think you would watch it?
And I think that goes back to what I was hinting at before. If there's some level of coordination and understanding that the stuff outside of the main season is really ancillary and table stakes, and could they be of intrigue enough to have a league, say, around flag football or a European league, maybe in warmer markets in the NFL off season? Sure, but it's if the NFL has anything to say or do about it, it's going to be with the pretty explicit understanding that this is just part of the NFL pyramid, of which the real original thing is the top of, right? But I think that the counter to your argument, which is a good one, is it's business 101, diversification of revenue streams and keeping interest and revenues that come from that interest alive before and after said season, because we've already perfected the in season. And this NFL Network's got stuff to fill in the rest of the year, right? There's and I just, flag football to me is intriguing because number one, it maybe is a pathway out of the safety problems. And number two, it's also a way to develop some level of skills that are not college football and that aren't these spring leagues, which is basically the same product, but clearly inferior to the real thing. So it's different enough where people could to me, that's like indoor soccer. Indoor soccer, when it came about was like, the whole reason it existed in the first place was to keep players fresh and develop some closer ball skills. And yet some people tinkered with it and put some dasher boards around it. And it became really interesting to watch by itself, even for a whole bunch of fans who weren't even soccer fans. So I think there's lots of little seeds that can germinate into, let's call them minor leagues or whatever, around elements of pro football and maybe feed in and not upset the big boys when they play in September and October. But, what do I know? I'm just a little podcast guy, just intrigued with how we got here in the first place. And I can't thank you enough. This has been more than wonderful. I said it before and I'll say it again. I think you're just scratching the surface on stories. I'm sure you have a life to live and other things that you want to pursue, but I can't imagine you won't get more inquiries as people continue to discover this piece, which will promote the hell out of about tell us more. And I would think you've got a company that you're part of that, could. I know they got rid of classic sports. I know 30 for 30 isn't as active as it was before, but there's clearly resources there. And I know you touched a nerve with this one for sure, because you touched mine. I know that.
I'll write the movie script. I'm in. Count me in.
Honestly, I cannot get enough of the WFL football story. Conjecture, stories, history, what ifs, all of it. It's probably the quintessential best example of why we do this show, and so much more to unearth and to uncover. And I'm officially jealous, of course, of Ryan for getting to talk to Gary directly, and rest assured, we are on the case as well. It's kind of a white whale for us, and we look forward, hopefully, knock on wood, for our own chance to talk to Gary, hopefully in a little bit more elongated form and hear directly from the man himself about what was going on, not only during that league, but his other exploits in the ABA and the WHA. And rest assured, many fascinating tales to come and pursuits thereof. You can follow Ryan and his exploits, his great writing, really good writer, at ESPN.com, of course. You can follow him on Twitter at Ryan Hockensmith. It's all one word, at Ryan, R-Y-A-N, Hockensmith, at Ryan Hockensmith. And you can follow us, of course, on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You could also find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available and on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. Our website, as aforementioned, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you'll find this episode, number 260, with Ryan Hockensmith, as well as every of the other 259 past episodes and all the episodes to come after this one. We post them all there. Of course, the best way to get all the episodes is to just put us in your podcast feed or follow it or whatever. We're available wherever you can find podcasts. I mean, there's really no excuse not to find it and get on board, shall we say. You can also, what else? You can send email to us if you'd like. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can sign up for our little weekly email newsletter. It's a little tip sheet. It's very basic. Gives you a little head start on what we're going to be talking about this coming week. And that's all we got for you at this point. Of course, Jerry Payne, can't do the show without him. Thank you, kind sir. A tip of our, our Florida Blazers cap in your general direction this week. Thank you. And to all of our great listeners, I appreciate your listenership. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week with more fun and frivolity. And God knows what the topic will be, but we'll find something for sure. Thanks very much for listening. Take care and stay safe, everybody. Bye.